Good morning everyone, I'm Den Haring. Welcome back to my channel, Fish Den 365. Today we're going to be talking about how and why to fish braided fishing line. So it's a beautiful Saturday morning. We're out here in my boathouse / tackle shop. I like spending time out here tinkering with tackle, getting things ready for the season. We're in mid-February right now, and it's time to start getting a lot of things ready, and that's why it's a good time to talk about braided line. So when it comes to fishing line, there are three major types of line. You have braided fishing line, you've got monofilament line, and you've got fluorocarbon line. And all three of these lines have their applications. They all have some positives and they all have some negatives, pros and cons. So when you're fishing, you want to set up your fishing so that you can accentuate the positives to make them better and to mitigate or to negate the negatives so that you don't have some of the more negative things take place that can happen with these different fishing lines. So I fish braided line on everything now. On every rod, and there's not an application anymore where I don't fish braided line. Now I still use fluorocarbon and monofilament lines. I just use those as leaders on the braided line, and that's what I want to talk about in today's video. First, why braided line, and then secondly, how do we use these other lines to get the most out of our application for fishing. So braided line, the first thing that you'll notice with this line compared to fluorocarbon and monofilament is that it is extremely limp. First, it's very thin. So this is 20-pound test line. I've been using this for a while. This is Spider Wire Stealth. I still prefer this line. It just casts very well. It casts a mile. It holds up well. The abrasion resistance is good on it, and the knots tie very well. So it's just a line that I really enjoy using and will continue to use. But when you look at this line, this is 20-pound test, and the diameter is equal to what 8-pound test would be in monofilament or even fluorocarbon. So it's very, very thin. Now this is yellow line, and you can see that's very bright, and there's a reason why I use yellow. Sometimes I also will use a very dark green line, and we'll explain that in a minute as well. Show you this, you can see this is dark. You might not be able to see it because it's so dark of a line. But when we look at this, it's extremely limp. It doesn't have a lot of memory in it. In other words, it won't coil like fluorocarbon coils or even monofilament. In fact, monofilament, I believe in some cases can coil even more. This one's coiled so badly I can hardly get it off the spool. So you can see how this coils. See how that lays off the spool like that? It's just coiling. And you straighten out this braided line and it won't do that. It's just, and I can do that, I can pull on this coiled line and it'll go right back to a coil. See that? So it's limp, right? And because it's limp, it casts like a dream. That's one of the big advantages of braided line. Compared to fluoro, compared to mono, you can cast it a mile further, whether you're using a bait casting rod or whether you're using a spinning rod. The applications are still the same as far as casting distance. So that's the number one, or it's not the number one in priority perhaps, but it's number one in our discussion here for why I use braid. I can cast a lot farther with it. Now there's another property that braided line that is very different than monofilament and fluorocarbon, and it's stretch. Monofilament has the most stretch. So what I mean by that is, if you take this monofilament line and you were to take a pull tester device and start pulling on this until you get to the breaking point, you would see that it's got stretch in it, up to 20-25% stretch before it actually breaks. So this line actually stretches. If I did the same with fluorocarbon, it's likely to be a little less stretch, but it still stretches. Probably 10-12% stretch, so there's still stretch in fluorocarbon. If you do that with braided line, there's virtually no stretch in this line at all. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because when you're fishing and you're using, say, a soft plastic bait or a jig, because there's no stretch in that line, you feel everything. It transmits what's on the end of that line much better through your rod and into your fingertips. So when I'm holding onto a rod and I have my finger on the line like this, and I have the rod in my hand like this, and I have a fish, or even let's just say I'm throwing something on the bottom gets transmitted better through braided line than it would through fluorocarbon, and even more so through monofilament, because monofilament has more stretch. So there's good things about that stretch, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So again, braided line, much better feeling. So when I'm fishing soft plastics, or when I'm fishing jigs or those types of baits, I'm much more likely to feel when I have a bite. I know when to set the hook because it transmits what's going on from the bait to my fingers and through the rod much better. Another huge advantage of braided fishing line versus monofilament and fluorocarbon. So let's talk about why we use the bright yellow. So I like this yellow line anytime I'm fishing where I want to see my line. And that would be anytime I'm fishing soft plastic lures, jigs, those type of applications. I want to be able to see the line because oftentimes you can look at the line and see if you got a bite or not. So you're doing two things. You're using your fingers and your rod and feeling with your hands, but you're also looking with your eyes. And you can just see the line and see what's happening with your bait. You can see where your bait or where your line is entered into the water. It's just an easier way to be focused on what you're fishing and what you're doing, being able to see the line. There's a time where I don't care about that though. I don't need to see the line if I'm throwing a topwater lure. So I'll use 50, this was 20 pound, this is 50 pound braid. It's in dark green, it's spider wire, stealth, same stuff, thicker. 50 pound braid is equal to 12 pound monofilament in diameter, but it's extremely strong. And in Pennsylvania where I fish, I don't feel that I need to go higher. I know some of the southern fishermen, they like to go even up to 80 pound test, 65 to 80. 65 is quite common. But here where I fish, the cover is such that, and the fish are such that they're not, you don't have as big a bass, and the cover may not be quite as thick or as abrasive. So when I'm fishing lily pads, for example, or really thick top water on weeds, this line is fine. 50 pound braid is what I use. I'll throw a frog on that, for example. I can see the frog, I can see what's happening on top. I don't need to see my line because I'm looking at the top water lure the entire time. So in applications like that, I'll just use this line without any leader, right into the slot. So when do I use a leader versus when I don't use a leader? Then that's another good question. So if I'm fishing very heavy cover, let's talk about milfoil beds, real thick milfoil, or like we said, lily pads, any kind of weed, thick weed cover, then I've gotten to the point now where I don't even use a leader anymore. I'll use my colored line, and what I'll do is I will take a marker, a black or a dark green or even a brown marker, and I'll just color the end of the line, maybe the last several feet of the line from my bait upward in that color, so that I can still see the line where it's entering the water, but the fish can't see it so well under the water. And with that line in the weeds like that, I haven't found that it makes any difference whether or not I'm using that high, that braided line versus monofilament or fluorocarbon. So that's an application where I'll use straight braid. I already mentioned another application where I use straight braid, and that is if I'm fishing slop, topwater slop, lily pads, milfoil beds, hydrilla on top. No need to use a braid. No need for me, in my opinion, to use a leader in that case. I'll just use the line right to the frog. The fish aren't going to notice it with all that other slop. They're going to focus in on the frog and get it. And I really feel that having a leader actually causes more trouble, because now you've got a knot, and that knot has to go through all that slop. You've got a knot that can fail when you set the hook on a giant bass through the pads. Your line can get wrapped, and your knot can get wrapped around pads. It's just overall, in my opinion, your odds are better without it. That being said, though, when I'm fishing more open water, and especially clear water, now I feel that I need to have some kind of leader on the end of my braided line. And so let's start with a topwater application. Let's say we're fishing open water, topwater, maybe a popper or a Zara spook or some type of walk dog bait. I always go with braided line. I'll go with the 20-pound test spider wire stealth, and then I'll tie several feet of monofilament line to the end of that. Usually it's my wingspan, which is about 7 feet, or maybe just a little bit more. And so I'll tie that knot on here. I use a double uni knot. There's a ton of videos out there on YouTube if you want to look up how to tie a double uni knot. If you're interested in me showing that knot sometime, I can do that in a future video. But I use a double uni knot to do that, and I'll use monofilament. And it's important to use monofilament if you're fishing topwater. The reason for that is monofilament floats, and you want the topwater bait. Let's say this is a topwater bait. You don't want your line to have a belly down here underneath. And if you were using fluorocarbon line, that's what's going to happen because it sinks. So it'll start to get a little belly, and it just won't work the bait as well, and it could also catch on the hooks. So monofilament works better because that line's more likely to float near the surface of the water. Just makes your presentation better. Conversely, if I'm fishing underwater, maybe I'm throwing a swim bait, a spinner bait, a crank bait, all of these underwater applications in water that is mainly open with some sparse cover or with some cover, maybe rocks on the bottom, that kind of thing, I'm always going with braided line, and then I will tie a fluorocarbon leader on. And fluorocarbon sinks, so it makes sense. I want my bait to get closer to the bottom in those applications, and I'll use that same uni to uni knot, put that fluorocarbon line on there, tie it onto the braided line, same, about the wingspan of my arms from hand to hand. If I'm fishing a drop shot, I go a couple extra feet because you have to have that drop shot extra line down, but I'm using a leader for drop shot as well. And so that's what we do. And so, you know, it's a little extra tying up of leaders and that kind of thing, but man, I can get a much farther cast than the average fisherman can with my braided line versus what they've got with monofilament or what someone else might have with fluorocarbon. And the other nice thing about braided line is it's much, much less likely to backlash. Now, when it does backlash, it might be a little harder to get out, but it's much less likely to backlash. It just comes off your spool nicer. And let me talk a little bit about spinning rods. So everything we said about bait casters, all those positives are also positives for a spinning rod, even more so when it comes to braided line. Braided line, because it's so limp, it just lays on this type of spool, on your spinning reel spool, so much better. And you're just so much less likely to get one of those bird nests coming off of there than you might if you were using fluorocarbon or mono, especially as you go higher in pound test, the thicker lines. And that's another nice thing about the braided line. You could use a pretty heavy pound test on spinning reel, 20 pound test, and still that's the diameter of what mono 8-pound test would be. So it's just really nice in that regard, because you can get your line on there, you can throw it a country mile, and then you have all the advantages of no stretch, better feel, and all the things that we've already gone over. So this is why I love to use braided line on spinning reels as well. And again, I'll use that depending on the application. I generally don't use spinning rods for topwater lures unless it's a tiny, tiny topwater. So most of my applications with spinning rods are underwater. Here's a little swim bait, for example, that I really like to throw. And I don't know if you can see this, but I have a fluorocarbon leader on there. I have probably 15-pound or 10-pound test braid on here, and this leader is probably 8-pound test. Just depends on the application for what you're doing and how deep you want to go in the water column. So this is some of the whys. We talked about how and why to fish with braided line. So there's a lot of reasons why braided line is an advantage if you accentuate the positive, like we said, and then mitigate some of the negative things. One of the reasons why I would never throw a topwater in open water just on straight braid is because that braided line is so darn limp that it could easily get hooked on the bait that it's at. Because it's so limp and it doesn't coil, you have a bait on the end, and so you can get this little sag in the line, and it can, when you're fishing walk the dog baits, for example, oftentimes it'll hook onto the front hook and just throw the bait off. The bait won't work right that way. So I always use a monofilament leader when I'm fishing top waters and open water using braided line. Let me show you a couple tricks with this too. There's another huge advantage that braided line has that mono especially, and even fluoro doesn't, and that is it lasts longer. It lasts a lot longer. So if you put monofilament line in sunlight and leave it there, it actually begins to degrade, and it can become brittle and break very easily. So when you store monofilament, make sure that you're storing it in a cool, dry area where there isn't any direct sunlight, because sunlight affects the nylon that makes up monofilament, and it could deteriorate it. And the same kind of thing can happen over time with fluorocarbon to a lesser extent. But with braided line, that's not the case. Braided line just can hold up so much better and so much longer. And you could actually fish the same line, the same braided line for years, depending on how often you're fishing. Now, I fish pretty often, and I don't want to take any chance on having my braided line get weak over time. So I have a little trick that I use. I'll share that with you. But if you don't fish very often, if you're just going out there 10, 20, 30 times a year, you can keep that braided line on that reel for 2-3 years before you do anything to change it out. And even when you change it out, you can just reverse it and get another 2 or 3 years. And that's what I do. I reverse the line. So we'll show you a couple tricks on how to do that next. Okay, let's say we have a situation where we want to reverse our line. It's the end of the year now, and it's time to take our line off our reel. But we don't want to throw it away because the bottom of the reel never gets seen. What I do is when I put new line on my reels, I put 75 yards of braided line on the reel. I put a backing on the reel. The backing can be cheap monofilament line. I use cheap line for the backing because I don't ever intend to get to the backing. I'm putting 225 feet, 75 yards of braided line on my reel on the top. So I have a backing on the bottom, and unless I get a monster fish that's taking off to Kalamazoo somewhere, it's not gonna, I'll never get to see that backing, and so I don't care what's on there. How do I know that I have 225 feet on top of my backing? Real simple, I use a line counter. So I just put the line counter on the rod, I put the line through it, and I start spooling it onto the rod. When I get to 225, I know I have 75 yards on there. That's how I know. So I guess I have this down to a science, and I like to control it that way. So now what happens over time is you can see how yellow this line is. This line here is actually this line here. It turns white over time. It just fades out. The color on the line just starts to fade off. This is 1 year of usage. I've used this for a year, last year. But the line at the bottom of the spool, at the bottom of those 75 yards that I put on, is still like this. It's fresh. So what you can do is take this line off and then reverse it and put it back on the reel so that what's on the bottom is on top. And here's a way that you can do that rather quickly. Get yourself a battery operated drill like this and a toilet paper roll or even a paper towel roll. It doesn't matter. You just put it on there, and what you can do is just lay your reel down, gauge your spool, and you can just wrap it a few times here, and this is how you can get it off. So once you get that line off your reel, you're going to want to put it on a different reel if you're doing what I'm doing here, because if you just put it right back on your reel again, if I was just to put it right back on this reel, it would be on the same way it came off. So the used line would be up top. So what I did was I reeled it onto this one. You can see the white on top. And now all I have to do, this is just a junky reel that I don't use anymore, is tie this to my backing on the reel that I want to have the line on. We'll do that real quick. I just use a real simple knot to do that. First I got to get the line through here, through my spool on the reel. Let me do that. Alright, I got it through there, and what I'll use as my knot for this is just a uni to uni again, but only with 2 loops. When I'm tying it as my leader, I use 5-loop knot, but because this is just backing and I never intend to get to the backing, just a quick 2-loop knot is all I need. So we'll tie that knot. There's 2 on one side, 2 on the other. Wet it down real good. Draw it tight. It's good and tight. Then we'll snip off the tag ends of the line. I've already cleaned my rod, so it's ready to go. I just need to put my reel on here. We'll do that next. I'm gonna engage this spool, lay it here, and all I gotta do is reel my braided line back on again. So we'll do that quickly here. And there it is, and you can see that looks like brand new line because it is. That was on the bottom of this same reel. All I did was I reversed the line. So now I have fresh line to fish with again. 75 yards down is where that, where the last year's line that I fished, but I'll never get down that far. And so this is one way to extend the life of this. So I do this every year. I'll reverse my line once a year because I fish pretty often. And then I do another little trick to know where I stand. So what I do is I'll put a piece of black electrical tape on my rod. I'll show you why in a minute. Running low on tape. I need some more electrical tape. Okay, so we'll cut that off here. There we go. And so what I'll do now is I'll put this electrical tape just around the handle of my rod here. And all that is there for is to remind me that next year I don't have to flip this line around. I'll throw it away next year. So I got a little piece of electrical tape, doesn't really add any weight or any harm on my rod. That tells me that next year, when it's time to go to at the end of the year, when it's time for me to maintain my reel, clean my reels, oil my rods and reels and all that good stuff, when I take my line off my reel, I won't be reversing it again. I'll just be taking it off, throwing away, and putting fresh line on there. And so that tells me that this one's got 1 season left. If I don't have any tape on there, it means I've got 2 seasons. And this is just a little code that I use in my own mind, so I know exactly where I stand with my rods and reels. Well, I hope that answers a lot of questions that you might have had about why to use braided line, how to use braided line, the advantages, the pros and cons, how to mitigate the things that aren't so good, and how to accentuate the things that are. And if you like the video, please give me the thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. When you do, you might want to hit that bell. That'll give you a notification for when the next video is available. Remember, we're certified Bassified, and as always, may God bless your fishing endeavors.